HMS Eagle was one of the earliest aircraft carriers and served in the Royal Navy. Like many early carriers, she was a conversion, but like the Kaga and Bern, she was converted from a battleship hull and would suffer many of the issues associated with this particular kind of conversion. Her origins actually lie back before World War I, when Chile ordered two super dreadnoughts, the Almirante La Torre and Almirante Cochrane. Both vessels were still under construction when the war broke out, and both would end up being purchased by the Royal Navy. Almirante La Torre became HMS Canada and would end up seeing action at the Battle of Jutland, whilst the less complete Almirante Cochrane was eventually purchased in 1918 with the explicit intention to turn her into a carrier, as she had most of her hull complete but had not had belt armour installed or the superstructure built. The initial plan called for a full-length flight deck and two islands, one on either side, plus a mast. This had a very odd appearance, as the islands were actually at different points along the sides of the ship, but connected with the diagonal flying bridge, creating an offset tunnel that aircraft would have to navigate down. The ship would also carry 9 6-inch guns, along with a nest of 4 single 4-inch guns, the latter of which would also be positioned atop the flying bridge. Luckily for all concerned, trials on HMS Furious found that pilots tended to turn to port during an aborted landing, and someone realised that perhaps asking landing pilots to fly through a steel tunnel was a bad idea, and so the port island, and with it the flying bridge structure, was eliminated. Instead, many of these features would be incorporated into a larger single starboard island, which now had the bridge and the funnels built in, but also a rather significant tripod mast that was there to carry the fire control equipment for the ship's guns. Admiral Beatty remained full of brilliant ideas and demanded that the anti-aircraft battery be reduced to a single 4-inch gun, presumably for morale purposes, but the anti-surface weaponry was to be increased to 12 single 6-inch guns and no less than 18 torpedo tubes in 6 triple mounts, 3 per side, ostensibly allowing the aircraft carrier to fight German cruiser squadrons in a close-range night fight. As a battleship, she had been planned with a 4.5-inch upper belt over the main belt, and so this was moved down to become the actual main belt. Her machinery had been improved to give 50,000 shaft horsepower, which would allow the ship to hit a relatively pedestrian 24 knots for an aircraft carrier on 4 shafts. However, World War I ended before she was completed, and Chile would rather prefer to have had their second battleship back, but the costs of converting the partially completed carrier back into a battleship were too high compared to the buyback cost that the Chileans were offering, and the Royal Navy ended up keeping the ship. With other carriers such as Argus and Furious being flush deck, the Royal Navy wanted experience in flight operations from a carrier that had an island in order to help inform the design of the upcoming Hermes, and so the partially finished Eagle was patched into a vaguely working state, which included the quiet removal of God's own torpedo battery, along with a few of the 6-inch guns, and the half-finished ship was sent for trials in 1920. The trials were relatively successful, testing the aerodynamics of the island as well as early forms of arresting gear. This revealed, amongst other matters, the need for carrier aircraft to be fitted with landing gear shock absorbers to prevent heavy landings snapping off the landing gear or punching them clean through the fuselage. Other recommendations included toning down the surface battery still further in exchange for something more than a single anti-aircraft gun. All of these factors and more would see the ship back in port in 1921 for completion to a further revised design that was based on these lessons. The flight deck was joined up with the bow structure, the island shape was revised for better aerodynamics, and the surface battery ended up being kept, but more 4-inch anti-aircraft guns were added on and around the island. The forward aircraft elevator was also moved and some anti-torpedo bulges were fitted. However, despite now clocking in at over 20,000 tons, her converted nature and relatively slow speed relative to other carriers meant that her air group was only about 2.5 squadrons at a stretch, more usually made up of 24 aircraft, deployed in 4 6-strong flights. Still, she was by far the largest aircraft carrier in the world in the early 1920s, pending the completion of the Washington Treaty conversions, and she was sent to operate with the Mediterranean Fleet, where typically one of her flights would operate from land at any given time. Additional medium anti-aircraft guns in the form of 40mm pom-poms would be added during this period, as well as a water spraying system to help put out fires. At the end of the 1920s, as more Royal Navy carriers were completed, she would also pioneer multi-carrier flight operations in concert with her youngest half-siblings. In the early 1930s, she was brought in for an engine refit along with more light and medium anti-aircraft guns being added, and one of the earliest anti-aircraft fire control systems. With this done, she was sent to the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and like Hermes, would spend her time hunting down pirates for a few years, before another refit in 1936, which installed even more anti-aircraft guns, and would enact small improvements in the hangar and magazine provisions. World War II would find her still based in the Far East, and so she would start the war hunting for German merchant ships and raiders, such as the Graf Spee in the Indian Ocean, as well as escorting troop convoys until May 1940, when she would be reassigned to the Mediterranean, where her aircraft began a series of relatively successful strike missions against Italian merchantmen and warships, bagging several destroyers and a submarine amongst others. Unfortunately, she was in need of repairs to her aircraft fueling system by November, and so she would miss the Taranto operation, instead transferring some of her aircraft to the Illustrious, which rendered the mission a single carrier strike force rather than a combined carrier strike. More convoy and strike missions would follow until mid-1941, when she headed for the South Atlantic via the Indian Ocean for more hunting of potential German raiders and their supply ships, before heading back to the UK in October for another refit. This would see her receive radar and improve the anti-aircraft defences still further by replacing 50 caliber machine guns with 20mm Oerlikons, amongst various other measures. In 1942, she would be back in action, ferrying aircraft to Malta in numerous successful voyages, taking out a number of attacking aircraft with its own fighter complement. Unfortunately, her luck would run out in August as she was providing air cover for Operation Pedestal with an air wing of 20 Sea Hurricanes, when the U-73 managed to sneak through the screen and land a salvo of 4 torpedoes, blowing out enough of the ship's hull to see it heel over and sink within 4 minutes, taking 131 men and 16 of the Hurricanes down with her.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.